We're here at Shelburne Bay Park this rainy morning, and I'm here with Ethan Tapper, one of my favorite foresters. And Ethan, you just had a book come out, which I have wrapped in plastic because I don't want it to be getting wet in the rain. How to Love a Forest. How's that going?
It's going great.
Yeah, you have a lot of book events that are happening, and
yeah, we're on a book tour right now, basically.
Yeah.
And it's been so gratifying just to see people get the book in their hands and to love it. And for me, it was a long process. It took me 6 years to write. So it's amazing just seeing it out in the world.
I'm so happy to have a copy, and I'm halfway through it. I'm looking forward to finishing it. It's hot, like off the press. I can still feel it.
Yeah.
Warm in my hands. So we're going to do a walk along a trail here at Shelburne Bay Park, and our goal is to find big trees. Ethan and I have both noticed over the years that there's some real monsters out here, and we'd love to share them with you. Talk about why they're here, their habitat, what makes this park a beautiful place to hike for many reasons, but today we're especially focused on trees. So I'll show you the route we're going to walk. It's called the Loop Trail, and on here it's also mapped as the Clark Trail. We're going to walk in along the lake, cut up over Allen Hill, go behind where a lot of the big trees are on this backside, this north side of Allen Hill, and then cut through and then loop back to the parking lot. So I'm excited for this. One of the things that's narrated here on this sign is that there's an unusual species on Allen Hill. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Chestnut Oak.
Chestnut Oak. So it's on this south-facing slope.
Yep.
Where it's dry and warm, and it's here in the Champlain Valley, but not a common species in Vermont.
No, I think here in Chittenden County, there's only about 4 or 5 places where it is.
Wow, and we're at one of them.
That's right.
So let's go find it.
Lucky us.
So come with us. We're going to go take a hike. So Ethan, you were telling me that one of the trees that surprised you out here was pitch pine.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it's a weird one to find here.
I thought so because you tend to look for fire.
Right. Yeah, we tend to find them on those sandplain type areas, and this is just a total oddball.
I know, and there's another one, and that's where Gino's going to meet us.
Oh,
so
good.
Let's go find him.
Let's go find him.
So Ethan, do you know Gino Desideraggio?
No.
He's a fellow
I haven't.
tree.
Well, we haven't met for a number of years.
Person passionate about trees.
Oh, hi.
Hey.
Hey, nice to see
I'm glad
you.
you could
Nice
join
to see
us.
you
Sorry
guys.
about the rain. Not totally my fault.
Oh, that's okay.
But,
we're in the forest.
We're in the forest.
We got one
rain,
little hemlock branch trying to keep us dry.
Rain happens, exactly. Yeah, so you got to talk about pitch pine with me. I mean, Ethan and I were just saying it's not a tree that we would have been on our I bet it's here list, so what's
Totally.
your thinking about what's going on here and how do you recognize it?
Yeah, well, first, just to recognize it, I think it has a really cool bark, like maybe one of the most interesting barks out of the conifers here. It has this armored plate-like appearance with these kind of chunks. And this is really kind of a similar general structure to how the white pine's bark is arranged, but it really has the colorful exfoliating bark where it's kind of reddish, even more red in the rain today. And as it peels up, you get these lighter, different shades of red, which really makes it look like the red pine, which it's actually a lot more closely related to than the white pine. So to compare and contrast those two pines, this is the one that'll have the plates, and the red pine doesn't really have this three-dimensionality in the furrows to the bark, but it'll be almost more red and colorful and mosaic-like. Yes, we'll definitely see one.
One further in. One thing I noticed about it too, and what you're describing, is to me it always feels like maybe a bricklayer.
Yes.
Kind of laid bricks on this
Especially
tree.
because it's so red, right?
But Ethan, what forestry values does this tree have? Not a ton, am I right?
No, well, so not from like a timber perspective, certainly, but it does. Its value is primarily as this really ecologically interesting tree that's part of these really uncommon natural communities on our landscape. So we talked about the sandplain natural communities that we find in the Champlain Valley, often at about 300 feet in elevation. All these sand deposits that were created by the Champlain Sea here. And it's a fire-adapted tree, and it only grows in these very specific sites. So where we do have sandplain forest, we usually have pitch pine, and sandplain forest is this really uncommon natural community type, I should say.
Yes.
And it's one that I should say that one of the reasons that it's uncommon is because sand plains are such a good place to build houses.
Right.
And so like Burlington, Essex Junction, all of those things are on these old sand plain forests.
And I usually, when I'm in these forests, like out at Sunny Hollow and Colchester, don't see them regenerating in the understory. But there is one place in Burlington at Star Farm Park where there's enough historical disturbance that they've gotten started there again, and they're young. You know, you don't see a lot of young pines, pitch pines.
Right, and I know that there's, that often their cones will be serotinous, sealed by pitch, so they won't actually open unless they're burned. Although I believe that because we haven't had burning on our landscape for a long time, that our pitch pines now are much more non-serotinous.
They've shifted.
They've shifted. So there used to be
a
a few that were non-serotinous, and they were mostly serotinous, and now they're mostly non-serotinous with a few that are serotinous.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of natural community for a minute, because that's a really important thing when you think of not just the trees, but the forest and the assemblages of plants and animals that you find that occur together in different places throughout the landscape. How do you work with that concept as a forester?
I think it's such an important concept. And of course, the sort of textbook definition of it from wetland, woodland, wildland is an assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So it's this much more inclusive definition that includes not just the trees, but all the trees and the plants and the animals and all the pieces and parts of this community, and also even the abiotic parts of this community, and also even the natural processes that affect these ecosystems. And those of us who deal a lot with ecosystems know that, you know, you can't just manage a forest as a bunch of trees. You have to think about this much more expansive vision of what it is. And I think that we also need to think about, the neat thing about natural communities is it's not even just about what's here right now. It takes into account like what this forest may have been historically, the trajectory it may be headed on over a longer period of time. So it's just a really cool, more expansive, in-depth vision.
Absolutely, and from what I'm hearing from people who work in conservation is there's starting to be a shift in these thinkers, these deep thinkers about conservation, toward not just thinking about natural communities, but about the stage, you know, because that's the most permanent piece. So if it's a sand plain, if it's a limestone bluff, have we conserved a good, I'm going to use the word portfolio of those, so that as we go to the future and the trees reorganize themselves as climate changes, we'll still have unusual places.
Right. So, and I think the interesting thing about natural communities too is that it recognizes that like we might have a sand plain natural community with no sand plain species currently on it, because our landscapes are so affected by land use and especially like, you know, widespread landscape clearing. So we could have, you know, a pitch pine forest or a sand plain natural community that should have a high proportion of pitch pine with no pitch pine. And then I think that becomes an imperative to ask ourselves, how are we going to steward this ecosystem toward the natural community that could be there or should be there, that was there probably for hundreds or thousands of years until just a few hundred years ago? Such
an interesting question. Yeah. Well, it's been really fun exploring pitch pine with both of you. And I know just down the way, there's this open grown red cedar that I think would be really fun to spend a few minutes with. So let's head on down the trail.
Let's check it out.
Ethan, I've been hiking out here at Shelburne Bay Park for 30 years or more, and I was always struck by this red cedar. I mean, it's been here a long time. I tend to see them in undergrazed pastures, so places where cows were left, but they weren't really tended, and they weren't eaten, and so they come up as stands here in the Champlain Valley often. And I know there is a red cedar woodland, an actual natural community that you find a little more interior, kind of in the foothills of the Champlain Valley, kind of in bluffy, cliffy environments. But this tree, doesn't this tree strike you as kind of...
It is. It's amazing. And, you know, and like you, I think of red cedar as like a little bit of an oddball. It's weird to see. I think one of the reasons for that is that we are way on the northern end of its range. And actually, if you drive south, you start to see red cedar like everywhere. But here, yeah, we pretty much only see it in the Champlain Valley. We usually see it as an old field colonist, especially on these really rich soils. I often see them, these pastures that have gone fallow, that first generation is red cedar. And with that red cedar woodland community, everybody always thinks it's a red cedar woodland, but what it actually is what we call successional cedar. So it's red cedar that's there just for a moment in time, which is often transitioning toward a limestone cedar forest or something like that.
Wow.
and that over time those red cedars just die out. They actually perform the same function that white pine often does on abandoned pastures. They're just there for a moment. And the other thing that's really interesting about red cedar is what I hear from folks that are west of us, where what they see is that because of messification, so in these like savanna plains ecosystems, when they don't have fire, what they get instead is red cedar.
I have been reading about that, and it's the same species. You know, there is a western red cedar, but this is the one that's colonizing old prairies.
Yeah, and they actually, as they're trying to restore those grassland ecosystems, they're trying to kill as much red cedar as possible because they see it as like a weed,
isn't it? That's
taking over those really cool fire-adapted systems.
Huh. Well, I want to get a better look at this where we can actually see the bark, and so I'm going to hike in under it. Gino, you want to come talk about bark with me?
Let's go talk about bark. All right, so let's check out the bark of this red cedar. As you can see here, especially highlighted in the rain, it's pretty red on the underbark. It's got this awesome like fibrous, peely texture to it. A lot of times you'll see some like cat scratches on these kinds of barks. And down here, if we look at the base, it has this great lobing pattern.
Yes, it does. I see that.
This is awesome as an ID because we do have another cedar, the northern white cedar. And sometimes it'll have a little lobing, but it usually is much more circular or ovular at the base instead of having this almost flower pattern.
Exactly. Like if you cut this in cross section, you get like almost a child's flower outline.
Absolutely.
And animals strip this bark and use it for nesting material, right? Squirrels and some birds and other things. So, and tell me about the needles. Like what's striking to you about those?
Yeah, I think of the needles as being fairly corally. So they're sort of three-dimensional. They almost look alien and scaly. But compared to the white cedar, which is often referred to as lacy or ironed flat, these are much more clumped in a cluster.
Huh. That's really helpful. And I feel like I see them as slightly different colors. Does this one look a little more olive, sort of darker, sagey?
Yeah,
color?
I think I'd see that as well. The
the
white cedar is a little more like classic forest green.
All right. Well, let's head on up the trail and see what we find next. So Ethan and Gino, this is the Moncton quartzite that we're walking over, you know, and I'm sure you recognize it as this red stone of Red Rocks Park and Redstone Campus. And it's part of the Champlain Thrust Fault. It's on mostly the eastern half of Shelburne Bay Park. But it's part of the story of Allen Hill, and we'll tell that later. But what do you think of when you see this Moncton quartzite from a tree's perspective?
With a lot of these ecosystems in the Champlain Valley, right, it's always this play between soils influenced by bedrock and then soils influenced by like glacial lake deposits.
Exactly.
And the Champlain Sea deposits too. And so it's kind of interesting because on other sites you see much more consistent kind of soil character that's influencing the trees and the plant species that are there. And here it's just like everything all at once.
Right, and here right along the lake shore, you see it's shallow to bedrock.
Yeah.
Like these trees are having to root onto a flat surface, which has been scoured by glaciers. You see the striations in it. It's very polished. We're having trouble walking over it when it's wet. It's so slick, you know, and they're trying to hold on to it, you know. So it's just interesting to me how they're making that happen. And what I've seen through here is a number of blowdowns, and I tend to associate that with these shallow to bedrock soils. They just have to root so shallowly that they get thrown up sometimes.
And you know what's interesting about forest soils for me is that we think a lot about like rich soils and poor soils. So rich soils with a lot of available nutrients, especially like calcium and magnesium. Poor soils tend to be more acidic, more well-drained, less available nutrients. But then there's also the influence of things like soil depth and depth to hard pan, which can create situations where, you know, maybe you have a bedrock that could be creating a rich soil, but then you have shallow soils, which could be creating opportunities for tree species that we normally find on poorer soils to be here.
Oh, it's such an interesting dance between plants and what they root in and on, isn't it? Yeah, and one thing I think about with these, and we'll see this around the backside of Allen Hill, is where the white cedar come into this picture. So good at rooting in rock, so good at grafting to each other, you know, really hanging on to these landscapes that are difficult for a lot of other trees. So, Well, let's continue on and see
Yeah.
what we find next.
All right, well, here we've got a red pine, pretty closely related to the pitch pine we saw earlier. I definitely characterize it by having less of that distinct grooving three-dimensional bark, but much of that colorful mosaic-like exfoliating red bark. What do you have to share about it, Ethan?
Yeah, I think the bark is beautiful. I think it looks like slate, and just like you said, much less blocky than the pitch pine.
Yeah, and this is a tree that's similar to a lot of our conifers, really tall and straight. It does well on these like sandier soils. We'll often see these on hilltops also. Is this as fire adapted as the pitch pine?
We consider it a fire adapted species, though probably not as much as the pitch pine.
Not quite as much, yeah. But definitely not the most common pine or conifer here in Vermont. We'll often see like a little stand of them, but we won't see them dominating the forest the way that you'll see like a whole white pine stand as an early successional species. But definitely a beautiful tree to encounter in the woods.
Ethan, I saw this tree and I thought of you for two reasons. I know there are two qualities in this tree that you like. One, it's a red oak. And two, it's a big red oak.
Yeah.
So tell me why you love this kind of tree, oak trees and big trees.
Sure. I mean, I think, big trees of any species are relatively uncommon on our landscape. And most of the big trees we have are like this one, where they're what we call a wolf tree, which is just basically a big old tree that was standing alone in the middle of a field, sometimes for hundreds of years. I actually have a chapter in my book that sort of like follows a wolf tree along as they, the land was cleared around them in the 1800s, and then they were in the middle of a pasture, as this one was, maybe for over 100 years, and then a young forest grew up around it. So it's amazing to think about all the different worlds that these wolf trees have been a part of.
And you're growing one intentionally.
That's right.
At Bear Island, you've got one.
I call it the memory tree.
The memory tree.
But what's so amazing about big trees is they just provide all of these really cool habitats for wildlife. I mean, they are, as trees age, they develop this complex bark structure, as this one has, which can support really rich and diverse communities for invertebrates. They'll also support these really rich communities of mosses and lichens and liverworts, some of which may take hundreds of years to develop. And in addition to that complex bark structure, they'll often develop this complex canopy structure. So there'll be living wood and dead wood. There'll be tree cavities, holes in the trees that are really vital nesting habitat for all kinds of different birds and mammals. They're just this like really, really enriching feature for any forest to have, especially on our landscapes, which are so dominated by relatively young forests and younger trees.
And as I look about in this understory, there's not a lot of dead woody debris. And you think about these branches as they start to come down. You know, they're the size of a tree, really, and they're going to land on the floor and start to decompose and have redback salamanders underneath them and all the things that we enjoy about being out in the woods.
Totally, yeah. They're just, these big old trees, I do a lot of forest management, and when I do forest management, I always leave big old trees as what I call legacy trees.
Appreciate that.
And what the job of these legacy trees is just to be big trees, to be big old trees, to live for hundreds of years, and, even if they don't live for hundreds of years, they will provide another really important value, which is to be dead trees.
Wow.
And to be dead wood on the ground.
Yes.
And I think of them as these almost like little micro reserves in a way.
Absolutely. Well, you told me you had just been to Big Reed State Park in Maine and walked among many big trees.
Yeah, it was so amazing because I'm always thinking about old growth, because old growth forests, the conditions that we find there are the conditions to which all of our native biodiversity that's adapted to forest ecosystems have adapted to for thousands of years, and they're just so underrepresented across our landscape, and so all of those habitats are also underrepresented across our landscape. So Big Reed is a 5,000 acre area in Maine of old growth forest, and it was cool to see not just a little pocket of it, but actually this vast area of it. And what I found at Big Reed, actually, it was so interesting seeing old growth kind of like in situ, in action. I've read so much about it. I've seen small areas of it. What I found was that there were big trees, and the trees that were there were just covered in mosses and lichens, other bryophytes, liverworts, and really complex bark, really complex canopy structure. And also, there weren't a ton of really big trees. So it's sort of like, these little areas of bigger trees and one big tree surrounded by trees of all different sizes and ages that were just conferring to that forest these incredibly neat habitats and benefits.
So fun. I'd love to go there.
It's amazing.
And I'm heartened to know that within the Vermont Conservation Design Plan, the idea is to try to increase old growth in Vermont.
Yeah, and
there
I
are
think
all kinds of things going on in there, but that is one of them.
Absolutely, yeah, and to increase it both by letting forests be unmanaged and then also like managing some forests for those old growth attributes so that we can have those attributes and we don't have to wait another 200 years to develop them.
Cool.
And for me, what's so important about going to see the old growth forest, especially as someone who's a forest manager, is that I was like, this is what it means to be a forest. All of our forests are so altered. And here is an example of like, this is what a forest actually is.
Wow.
And then to use that as a template for, these are the conditions that we want to protect and also create when we can in our forests.
I love that idea. And I don't know if you felt this, but I feel like when I've had the blessing of walking among old trees in an old growth forest, it feels different.
Yeah.
There's something steady and grounded about those forests that you just sort of absorb. Did you feel that there?
And it also felt like I was almost like I was like meeting a famous person or something, where I was like, I've heard so much about you, and I've thought about you all the time, and here you are.
I love it. I love it.
Hey, so I got to take off, but it's been so nice getting to spend the morning with you both.
Thank you for coming out in the rain to talk about big trees and just enjoy Shelburne Bay Park with us. It's really a great resource for the diversity of trees and the size that some of them are.
It's amazing. I had a lovely time. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Gino and I are going to continue on, but we'll miss you and have a great time. And you've got book things to do.
That's right.
All right.
Have a
Good
great
luck
rest of
with
your
all
day.
that. Thank you. Gino, this Black Willow, as you know, our only willow tree species that is native to Vermont. And the rain's starting to lighten up, which I appreciate. But willows, I think of them and I think of water. I always see them right where I feel like their roots get wet seasonally. This one's right on the edge of the lake. They're often doing this. They're kind of collapsing toward and into the water. I see them do that. And I know that one of the ways, they're known for rooting from bare stock. They're very good at that. So if a branch breaks off, floats out on the lake or gets, drifts over to a new spot, they can take root right where they land, which I think is such a cool adaptation. How do you recognize these trees when you see them?
Yeah, well, these are really beautiful trees. I mean, I love these narrow leaves with a fine wavy serration. They're just these slender little sticks. And they're covered with these sprouts, which are awesome. They give it this very like jungly sort of appearance. And the bark is these long furrows that are sort of peeling off and chunky. A lot of times, especially a younger willow, the bark will be really tricky when we're comparing it to our other species. Like it could look like a box elder or an ash. But when they get older, they start to get this like more blocky texture, and the exfoliation here really tips me off. You start to kind of see these chunks falling off and these larger chunks here. Definitely a beautiful tree to find out in the woods, but sometimes can be described as a little messy.
They do fall apart. And one thing I noticed about them in the winter is, so they're closely related. Weeping willow has that very yellow draping branch structure. These guys are more upright, but their branches are kind of a bright brown-orange color in the winter. So I always love knowing a tree in all seasons, and this one's makes it easy in a lot of ways. And like you said, the fact that it's sprouting everywhere, right by the water, has this furrowed bark. It is a tree that you can start to recognize like the face of a friend. This is the willow.
Yeah, it's a great tree. And I like what you said about it sprouting straight from the stalk. Like I have this awesome experience of seeing this house on Route 15 that has put these willows just like in as a fence. And I saw it when I first learned about willows, and now it's been, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years later. and I've just watched this fence of trees grow up. And it's such a cool way to not have to go to Lowe's and buy a bunch of lumber, but you could just plant a tree without much effort, and all of a sudden you have all this cover.
Have a fence. And
Yeah.
people have, I've seen examples where people have woven them into archways, growing trees.
Yeah.
You know, and they were, of course, used for basket making. They do have the very flexible twigs. And so just an all-around useful and beautiful lakeside and riverside tree.
Very versatile.
Very versatile. Yeah. Well, let's head on and see what we see next.
All right. So what we have here is one of my favorite trees. It's fairly common here in the Champlain Valley. This is American basswood, and this tree is an excellent tree for to find in wetland areas. It'll often be kind of curving out over the river, over a lake. If you look up here, you can see that it's really curving out in this graceful manner. So the American basswood is closely related to the linden trees, which are common ornamental trees. You'll see them all around Burlington. And if we look at the curvature of the branches, it's really apparent why this tree and its relatives are known as ornamental. I think it's a very graceful tree. Even on the fine twigs, they kind of curve up and out. They don't really seem like they're in a hurry to get the light as some of these other trees that shoot straight up. And one thing that's really cool about this situation is there's multiple trunks here. I believe there's 4 of them. And this is a tree that when cut will often sprout from around the ring of the perimeter of the stump. And that's what I think happened here, is that these 4 trees are actually coming from one much older root system. And if we were to look at the center of each of these trunks and draw a line, that would be the diameter of the old basswood that they sprouted from. So pretty cool to be able to read the history of this tree. I love the bark on American basswood. Much like most trees we have here in the Northeast, it has vertical furrows, but these vertical furrows can be characterized by being fairly long and continuous. A lot of trees will kind of have obvious horizontal breaks, or it'll be a more consistent diamond lattice like we see here. But on the basswood, it's characterized by really having these almost lattices that are somewhat imperfect, and these long stripes of smooth bark that'll sometimes go for 2 or 3 feet. This tree is a really common tree that the sapsuckers like. So there's these holes that are almost an ID characteristic of their own that are just these horizontal lines. It's almost like you can imagine the bird eating some corn, right? So it's pick, 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 scoot over, pick, 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 scoot over. It's a very cute thing to think about. So this is the leaf of the American basswood. It has this distinct drip tip and this consistent toothy serration, but most notably, it has a asymmetrically lobed heart shape right here by the petiole. So this looks much like someone tried to draw a heart, but wasn't very good with symmetry, and it is a great ID characteristic for the tree. So here we can get a look at the bud of the basswood tree. This is an interesting bud because it has these 2 scales that kind of come together, and then there's this one scale on top. And you know, there's many silly little ways that we can get our brain to recognize these tree characteristics. And this one was described to me, I think by Alicia, but maybe also by other professors, as a mouse wearing a motorcycle helmet. So if you're out in the woods and you're uncertain about your basswood ID and you're looking at the leaves and the bark, if you find a bud that looks like a mouse wearing a helmet, it is definitely a basswood.
Gino, you can see this is a much younger forest than the ones we've been walking through. And when I looked at the 1942 aerial photos, this part was still in pasture. So most of this forest we know has at least been around for 80 years and probably longer, and some of the trees, a couple of hundred of years. But here we have the pasture, we have the barbed wire that tells us it was a pasture. We have the barbed wire growing into the tree that tells us it was a pasture a while ago. The barbed wire is on this side of the tree that tells us the animals were on that side of the tree because they want the animals to lean into the wire and have the tree stabilize it. instead of having it pop off. And if we look over here, we see this red cedar, which is dead, but was open grown. You see the branches leaning toward this, what used to be pasture. There's just a lot written right into this little story of this landscape. So we know this forest was close to agricultural lands, and that's pretty much the story of almost all of Vermont. I love this red cedar just as it's even dead and dying. It's looks like driftwood, you know, it just has a lot of character and complexity to it. And you were noticing the red underbark, which is also beautiful. But let's continue on. We're about to hit Allen Hill and we'll go up in elevation and we'll find some things we haven't seen yet.
Sounds great.
Let's do it.
Oh my goodness, that's a big white oak.
That is a big white oak. Wow, I feel like my head's tipping all the way back just to barely see all the way up there. Yeah, look at that guy.
Definitely multiple arm
Multiple
spans
people
for
hugs,
me.
huh?
Yeah, we're not even going to be able to touch on the other side.
At least we need Ethan here. Why'd you leave so soon?
So this is a beautiful specimen, white oak. I really love this bark. As it's getting to this age, you can totally see the sort of patchiness, where a lot of folks who have these large trees on their property will think, oh no, it's sick, the bark is falling off. But we're really actually just getting lucky that we have found an old enough tree that we're seeing that old growth bark where you get these chunks falling off from just the tree growing more bark and sloughing it off. And also all of the critters that run up and down this tree that are stepping off these little chunks of bark.
Yeah, and you know, when I walk near white oaks, I'm not rolling downhill on acorns. They're gone. You know, the animals love them. They have less tannins. And they fall and germinate in the fall. So the animals, the squirrels and chipmunks and turkeys and everything, they need to eat them right away or they just turn into small trees. So they're taken quickly. And I understand because of that, the less tannins, they're sweeter. They're a little less nutritious, less protein than the red oaks. But the red oaks, they fall and then they overwinter for at least a year and germinate later. So they tend to be the ones that the animals store. But they're also, they just hang around longer. I can be walking down a steep slope sometimes on red oak acorns and just feel like I'm just going to slide all the way down.
It's like marbles.
There's so many of them. It is like marbles. And those years are, they're variable because they're massed species, meaning they have massed years where they produce a lot of acorns the same year. And that tends to synchronize among the oaks in a certain area. They're communicating with each other about that. So, yeah.
And that's a way just to kind of trick the populations of predators for their acorns, right?
Right. So they have boom years and bust years, and that impacts how many squirrels you have, for instance, in a landscape.
Totally. Yeah. Beautiful tree.
So we're about to head uphill, and we're going to find new and more varieties of trees as it gets drier.
Sounds good.
Gino, this is a nice white pine. Really, you can see how tall it is. When I see white pine, I think of how it was kind of the tree that made the United States. You know, certainly New England. There were so many uses for white pine, from building the original log cabins that people lived in while they built their sturdier homes. So flooring, it was lightweight, it would float downstream easily, it was easy to maneuver and work with, and there were so many of them and they were so big. So how do you recognize them? I mean, they had a major role to play in the American Revolution, for instance, because the king would send his soldiers out to mark them with the King's Cross. Any of them that were over 23 inches in diameter were supposed to belong to him. And the colonists were not all on board about that, so there was conflict. But how do you know this tree when you see it?
Well, first thing I look for is the same thing that the king was looking for, right? A tall, straight tree. In his case, he wanted to make ship masts or other construction. But yeah, these are one of the straightest, tallest trees that we have around here. You know, we often see them in these big stands, especially in areas that are going through early to mid succession. And they're just really great at capitalizing on that full sun and just totally taking over an area for a period of time, while the slower growing hardwoods are kind of filling in the understory. If we look up, I like to call this a lollipop canopy, right? So all of the foliage is up there, and that signifies that this is a shade intolerant tree. But it also makes for a great understory and midstory where these other trees can grow and develop. In terms of identifying it, we're looking at, once again, these coarse vertical furrows. It looks a little bit more like the pitch pine in that it has kind of these chunky sections that can sometimes be brick-like, especially on even larger individuals. But unlike the pitch or the red, it has more of this like dark brown color to it. It doesn't really have that rich red, flaky, exfoliating bark. The needles are on the twig like this, and they're all in these little bundles. And what's really convenient about this tree is these needles are clustered in a bundle of 5, which I can't quite pull apart in the rain. And that conveniently spells out WHITE.
So there are 5 needles, 5 letters in white, and these very recognizable, distinct, long, sort of open cones that you stumble on in a lot of the lower elevation woods in Vermont.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think of the white pine cone as sort of the classic pine cone that people think
area.
about, especially here in New England. It's just like long and obvious. It's not one of the little ones that's more likely to get lost
hemlock
in the duff.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think I had fully absorbed what it meant to be a tree used for ship masts. But it started to dawn on me as I read more and more about this that you want a lighter weight tree. You don't want your mast to be the heaviest thing on the boat. And at the time that these trees were discovered, in America by colonists, all of the big trees had been cut from almost all. So they were starting to cobble together these ship masts from spruces, I think, and firs from the Baltics. And so they were so excited to have this new supply of ship masts. And, I'm sure they had other uses for white pine as well.
Yeah, I think back in those times in Europe, they had basically cut down all their forests, and they were doing a lot of coppicing, like cutting to get small bits of lumber rather than letting trees grow big enough for these large quality boards and ship masts.
These trees could be giant. And in our forest, often when I look out over a hillside, it's the white pine that jut above everything else. They're just taller, and they get taller very fast because they're very fast growing. Like you can see in field pines, you can see 2-3 feet of growth between the whorls of branches, and that's all in 1 year.
Yeah.
So they're fast growing, and they do tend to often come into old pastures, old fields, and start off right away and leap up above the other trees.
Yeah, they're definitely pretty cool in how they will dominate a landscape and then exist as this emergent canopy over the forest once the other species that are a little slower to get their footing kind of grow in.
Excellent. Well, let's head up on the hill. I keep talking about this chestnut oak, and I know we're going to eventually get to it, but we're getting close. So let's go see what we see.
Sounds good.
We are starting to walk over a different kind of bedrock, and it kind of leaped out at me. First of all, it's crumbly underfoot, which I wasn't noticing with the Moncton quartzite. But I recognize this rock from the Champlain Valley, and I can see that it does fizz. The white is calcite, not quartzite. So this is the Iberville Shale, and it is the thing that is under the Dunham Dolostone, where you can see the Champlain Thrust Fault at Rock Point. But it's also under the Moncton quartzite here, which was thrust over it in a similar manner. And this is what's going to be enriching the soils. What I noticed was that basswood is at the base of the slope where these nutrients are all migrating, and this calcium carbonate is buffering the soil and just making all the nutrients more available for the plant.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's cool to see so much diversity of trees, and then you think about the Moncton quartzite as a hard silica-based rock comprised of sand metamorphosed together from sandstone, and that's not really what's giving it the calcium. It's the fact that the Moncton quartzite was thrust above, and there's all these chunks of the Iberville shale around, which is a much younger and more crumbly and also more calcium-enriched rock from its history of being, sediment from the bottom of the rich ocean life of the Iapetus Ocean.
Cool. I love that. And we'll keep our eyes out for diversity here. And we're going to talk about a significant natural community that we're about to walk past up here. And we'll highlight again that the soils are more neutral in pH and richer than the average soils of Vermont. So it's just that your story about the quartzite being more resistant too, it is kind of the capstone of this hill called Allen Hill because it has eroded less quickly than the surrounding Iberville shale. So the bedrock here is controlling topography. It's creating this south aspect that's going to provide habitat for the chestnut oaks. And it's also, together, those rock types are creating a richer soil here, which gives us more diversity. It's just such a great place. And part of its beauty stems from the diversity of trees that are here.
Yeah, and the intersectionality of the ecosystem that is here because of the different bedrocks together and the thrust fault.
Exactly. We're lucky. I'm glad to be here looking at this with you.
Me too. So here we see the bedding of the Iberville shale, right? So this is a sedimentary rock. We always think about layers with sedimentary rock. But in this case, these layers are not horizontal, right? They're vertical. And that's because they've been bent and folded about 450 million years ago in the tectonic orogeny, the mountain building event that created the Green Mountains and really shaped this landscape. So now we're up on this hill, and this hill only exists because all of this bedrock was folded and bent, and we're up here, and there's all sorts of bedrock exposures, but it's kind of cool on the walk up. You can see this soft rock that's just not at all in the orientation it was laid down in. So this is the Shagbark Hickory, probably one of the easiest trees to identify if you don't actually know how to identify it, right? You look at the bark, you say, wow, it's so shaggy.
Exactly.
And it's known as an important ecosystem tree because it has nuts, right? That's always a great thing for the wildlife, good source of fats, protein. And the leaves up there are really beautiful. They're compoundly arranged, and it's these narrow sort of lance-like leaves that often have a slightly fatter terminal leader with these big light bulb-like buds that I wish we could show you, but this is such a tall, proud specimen that I don't think we'll be seeing the buds on this one.
And the shakes come off of it like they release from the top and from the bottom. So you get this really shaggy C-shaped bark. And one of my favorite stories about shagbark is I've seen brown creepers nest up under the shags, and they are known habitat for Indiana bat, which is a federally listed mammal species that hibernates in caves in the Adirondacks. Then the mothers come over with their pups clinging to them in the springtime, and they'll tuck the baby bats up under these shags and go out and hunt for mosquitoes and other insects. And so these maternal colonies can have like 300 bats altogether in one tree that has this kind of shaggy bark. It can be a shagbark, it can be an old white pine, it can be an old elm. But it's just sort of delightful to think about bats using this tree, to raise their young, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How many other trees make little caves like that? That's awesome.
That is so cool. All right, let's head uphill.
Sounds good. Wow. Check out these huge chestnut
We're
oaks.
finally to the chestnut oaks.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, the much
awaited.
anticipated. Yeah, much anticipated. They're just, again, as Ethan was saying down below, it's not a tree I see a lot, and I just always love seeing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
these are probably the oak with the most three-dimensional bark. It's super strong, rigid, doesn't break off very easily like the white oak we saw earlier. And they're just so thick. And I think that what might be playing into the situation here is that this is also not the best site. So when trees are in a situation where they don't have a ton of great soil, it's maybe shallow depth to bedrock, they focus a little more on secondary growth, growing out growing wide, and part of that is for stability, right? They want to have strong roots and a big base. But as a result of that secondary growth prioritization, their bark is going to look almost older than it should for a tree of this diameter or this age. And that's what I think makes these two individuals especially outstanding, because you just walk up and they're like no oak you've ever seen. And even if you know chestnut oaks, you're like, wow, that's a pretty sweet chestnut oak with that bark. You find an acorn over there?
I found an acorn cap. I will find an acorn for you. But I love the caps. They're kind of, to me, they're thin. They're kind of like goblets. They're deep. Here's the leaf, which looks very much like a chestnut leaf, which is where the name comes from.
Yeah, I really like this leaf. It's got the rounded lobes that we associate with all the oaks that are in the white oak subgenus. So we can separate the white oaks from the red oaks, and they're just two kind of collections of oaks that are more closely related to each other than they are to the other color subgenus. So here we see these rounded lobes and a really shallow sinus. So the sinus is sort of the depth of this curve. And in this case, it really, looks more like a chestnut leaf or a beech leaf than it does an oak leaf, because oak leaves usually have those really deep U-shaped sinuses. So a pretty unique tree in both the bark and the leaf, and with this cute little acorn.
Here's what I could find of an acorn, and it fits with our story about how white oaks families, the whole white oak family, they get eaten very quickly because they're easy to consume. They have kind of a thinner coat on them, and they are sweeter.
Yeah, not having those tannins sure makes them a better snack than the red oak.
I think it's worth saying that too, Gino, that we're finding them here because it's warm.
Absolutely.
So the whole site, we've seen oaks and hickories as we've been walking, but chestnut oak in particular is at the very northern extent of its range, and it needs the south sun, it needs the shallow soils that warm up quickly in the spring. There's probably some lake effect that makes the site warmer as well. So it's got what it needs to survive here in this northern climate. So if this tree were in the center of its range, further south of here, it'd be much more widely distributed than what we see here in Vermont. And here it's really in the Champlain Valley,
on these
low elevation hillsides. It's where it can survive.
Yeah, it's always fun when searching for a tree becomes like a treasure hunt, right?
Exactly.
This is a tree I'm familiar with from growing up in Connecticut, and I look at the range map and it says that it stops when you hit the Vermont border, like they're common in Western Mass. But there's always this little spike that, depending on what resource you look at, goes further and further up the Champlain Valley with the lake effect.
There you go.
And it's just fun to search around and be like, I think this is the furthest north chestnut oak. Or maybe that one is.
And they do tend to express themselves as trees that are fighting to survive on a site. So they tend to be they have a lot of bark characteristics. It's what you're describing that you see, which makes them stand out. They have a lot of character.
Super strong trees.
Real strong. Let's keep moving.
Behind me here, we can see the northern white cedar, which is often an indicator species for high calcium enrichment in the soil. Behind it, you can see a bit of a cliff, and this is an interesting section of the quartzite, where the quartzite has abutted the dolostone that we see in the area, and as a result, we've got this interesting blend of quartzite that has a little extra calcium enrichment. And on the slopes around here, we have the oak maple limestone talus woodland, which on the ANR Atlas maps is known as a significant natural community for this region. And all of that to say that this environment has more calcium in the soil, and it has this crumbly talus underfoot, and that makes it a great habitat for the northern white cedar. Oh, this is awesome. This is the type of thing I just want to sit on, dangle my feet off, and look out over the lake.
Yeah, maybe if it wasn't wet and there weren't a big rock under it, I'd do that too.
Yeah.
But this is what I expect from cedar in these cliffy environments, is this sort of reaching out for the light, but also having to cling to the rock, and you get these upswept trunks that are just dramatic and beautiful. I've seen them basically going practically horizontal out over the water.
Yeah, they're
They're
pretty
really
cool.
amazing trees. They graft their roots together. They really root well into rock. I saw out at Kingsland Bay where there's this similar kind of cedar pine forest that there'd been a downdraft, there'd been a microburst, and all the hemlocks and all the red pine and everything else in that natural community just got thrown up by the roots. And the cedars snapped at the trunk. So the same forest that threw everything up
Wow.
had to break them because they weren't letting go of the earth, which is pretty amazing.
That's really
And then
cool.
they branched out and continued to live there as sort of much, much shorter trees. But there's another big one nearby
Let's go
that
check
we wanted to go
one
look
out.
at. Yeah, let's go look at that monster white cedar.
Now that's a big, beautiful cedar. Let's see if I can get all the way around it. Oh my goodness. That is awesome.
It is awesome.
Yes,
It's a
this is
champion tree, as white cedars go.
definitely a
Yeah.
champion. I think it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest cedar I've ever seen that's growing naturally, right? I've
Yeah.
seen some wide diameter northern white cedars like in cemeteries, right? Places where they've got full sun, and they're probably the fastest growing cedars around. But usually we see them on these cliff sides, in these places where their, resources are really limited. They're often clinging to a little scrap of rock. This one's definitely in a more choice site, but has also had to grow up in this forest where there's competition, where there's other tree species, a more dynamic environment than being just full sun in a meadow or next to a house in Burlington. There's definitely some big cedars in Burlington. Yeah, this is the northern white cedar. All right, so in terms of identifying this tree, we can look at the needles. These needles are really scaly. They're quite similar to the red cedar's needles, except instead of being clustered and clumped in sort of a ball, these are much more two-dimensional. So there's a little bit of a curve, but you can really see that they look like they've been ironed flat, and they look really lacy. The bark of this tree is nice and swirly and flowy, very similar to the red cedar, and often it's a little bit lighter in color. Right now it's pretty wet, so I wouldn't say it looks any lighter than the red cedar we saw, but it has these great grooves to it that are also pretty fibrous and are used by a lot of animals for their nest making, and it's just a really beautiful grain. The little tiny cones, they almost look like little round clam shells. They're very small. They kind of dangle down like bells from the twigs of this tree. And they're one of the smaller cones that we'll see on our coniferous trees. Maybe the only other one that's about this size is the hemlock, which we also have growing around us in this little grove. But this is a pretty special place overlooking the lake with such big cedars here. It really it brings me joy to get to see these trees get to live to an age like this.
Gino, I've known you a long time. Do you remember how we first met?
Yeah, I signed up for your landscape natural history course. It's an undergraduate course at UVM. And I liked it so much that I came back a semester or two later and took your winter trees course. And I'll never forget following you on one of those first field trips and seeing your little patch on the back of your backpack that had all these little flora and fauna, and it just said field naturalist. And I was like, man, it'd be pretty fun to be Alicia, just walking around the woods teaching people about nature.
Hey, it's still fun.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, I want to check in with you. What are you up to these days?
Well, I graduated from UVM in 2019, and I majored in forestry, minored in geology, and really focused on understanding the large landform processes that kind of create the ecosystems we see today. So this concept of natural communities we've been talking about is really interesting to me, kind of the marrying of the abiotic conditions and the biotic individuals and organisms that inhabit the land. And I've taken Vermont Master Naturalist Tier 1 and Tier 2, and I just have a mission now to interact with just your average folks and try and give them the knowledge that I had to get a degree for, because I just feel that the more that people understand the other players in our ecosystem, the more that we'll feel like a part of an ecosystem, and the more that everyone will be a better steward in the future.
I thank you for that.
Thank
you for that work. And thank you for joining us on another Vermont Master Naturalist hike. It's been a real pleasure. I feel your love for trees, and it's been such a joy to come out here and find a real variety of big, beautiful trees and talk about where they are and why they're here, and just explore their ecology and how to know them. So I really appreciate that. Join us next time. We'll have another adventure.